In the span of time that we interpret here, we talk about the black and white families that lived and worked here and made this their home. So that includes the Hammond family and also enslaved families and their descendants and later paid staff who stayed here for generations into the 1970s and beyond.
Redcliffe Plantation's first owner was James Henry Hammond. Born in 1807 in Newberry, South Carolina, he grew up in a family with a modest income. Redcliffe Park manager Chelsea Stutz believes his later success as a politician and planter was likely thanks to his wife, Catherine Fitzsimmons.
And her dowry and the enslaved labor that comes with that is what makes all of this possible.
In 1835, he is elected to the U.S. House of Representatives as part of the Nullifier Party, a pro-slavery and states' rights party that believes states should be able to nullify federal laws within their borders. Ashley Rust, park interpreter at Redcliffe, says Hammond was only in office for a short time before resigning.
He was experiencing some ill health at the time. He kind of describes it as an ulcerous stomach. He starts to take a lot of medicine that's mercury-based medicine, probably worsening his condition. And his doctor essentially prescribes him a trip to Europe to kind of help cure his illness.
Hammond and Catherine spent more than a year in Europe. While there, he developed an even harsher take on how society should work. Hammond is elected governor of South Carolina in 1842 and to the U.S. Senate in 1857. He gave a famous pro-slavery speech while he was a senator about his mudsill theory he developed while in Europe. In it, he says lower classes of people were meant to do menial tasks and perform the drudgery of life.
In his speeches, Hammond also makes that phrase "cotton is king" famous. And he's essentially arguing that no one should be making war on the South because of the South's power, which we know comes from having slave labor. And the South has their power in the agricultural sphere, in the economic sphere, and in their supply of crops, especially cotton.
Hammond became embroiled in scandal in 1843 when his brother-in-law, Wade Hampton II, publicly accused him of sexually assaulting his 4 daughters. The scandal caused him to be shunned by society and to lose his re-election for governor. Hammond was also known to have continually raped enslaved women on his properties. At least 2 are known to have children fathered by him, a mother and daughter, Sally and Louisa.
Yes, we have documented assaults from Hammond's own writing. This includes 2 specific women and children that we talk about, and that's Sally and Louisa, a mother and daughter, who were purchased in the 1830s. And we know Hammond assaults them and has children by them. And it's important to note, too, that we don't consider these consensual relationships. If someone is enslaved, they are not allowed to say no to their enslaver.
Hammond's diaries revealed his actions and were published in 1989. It also revealed he didn't believe he had done anything wrong. He even went so far as to blame his nieces for seducing and tempting him. The historians at the plantation say that although only primary accounts of the assaults are from Hammond himself, they try to give the victims a voice when talking about it.
At the end of the day, James Henry Hammond wasn't the person who had to deal with his assaults. He was the person who was largely unaffected by his actions toward people on the plantation. So when we talk about James Henry Hammond and his assaults on both enslaved women and his own like free white nieces, we really try to keep the focus on the women.
The Redcliffe Plantation mansion was built in the style of Greek Revival. While Redcliffe was a working plantation, its crops were not the typical cash crops of a southern farm.
So when he established the site in 1855, he starts planting vineyards on the south side of the Magnolia Lane or Magnolia Alley. And he plants about 9 acres of vineyards there that don't really work out the way that he had hoped.
Hammond died in 1860 at Redcliffe Plantation from an illness believed to be mercury poisoning. The property stayed in the family for more than a century. The Hammond family was not the only family that lived at Redcliffe Plantation. Hammond had dozens of enslaved people working there. Families like the Henleys and the Wigfalls lived and worked there for generations.
So we see families who have long time throughout the 1900s ties to this site. We see families who are eventually able to move away and start their own businesses. So there's kind of a full spectrum of the successes after slavery of families who were formerly enslaved here.
When Hammond died, he left Redcliffe Plantation and its enslaved people to his son Harry, including Sally and Louisa and their children, some of whom Hammond believed were his. An 1870 census shows them both living at Silver Bluff Plantation, another Hammond property. And in 1871, a Freedman's Bank record for Zeke Johnson shows his mother, Sally, lived with him and lists Louisa among his siblings. The park rangers say they know as much as they do about who the slaves were and who the Hammond family was because of the sheer number of records maintained by the family.
Why we're able to do that kind of interpretation so specifically and distinctly is the records that we have here. So we are rich with historical documents, artifacts that represent the history here that unfortunately just sometimes don't exist at other sites.
The final owner, John Shaw Billings, was James Henry Hammond's great-grandson. In 1955, he renovated the mansion and the old slaves' quarters, adding electricity to both. He donated the property to the state of South Carolina in 1973 to become a park upon his death. It became a part of the National Register that same year. Today, Redcliffe Plantation is a popular historical site to tour. School children go on field trips, usually in the 3rd grade, to learn about plantation life and slavery. They talk to the kids in such a way as to highlight the stark difference in how plantation owners and the people they enslaved lived.
We talk about, how enslaved children are represented in the plantation manual left behind from James Henry Hammond. We talk about work hours, what clothing people had.
Rust says most often the way they teach the topic to students really drives home how bad life could be for the enslaved before emancipation. She says sometimes the kids draw their own conclusions.
We have a little diagram of the dimensions of the home here, this large mansion, and also a diagram next to it of the cabins for the enslaved people outside. And we walked into this mansion and a kid looked at that diagram and said, that home, that cabin outside for the enslaved people that we were just in will fit inside the hallway of this mansion.
Stutz says they are working on making sure none of the enslaved families from the plantation are ever forgotten.
Here at Redcliffe, we represent the stories of the people who lived and worked here, and that includes the enslaved families. So we are actively working, combing through those documents to make sure we can find a name for each one of those people and make sure that visitors, when they come here, they can see those people here and have their names and stories represented.